Welcome, everybody. I'm James Dudarian. I'm the director of the Center for International Security Studies here at the University of Sydney, and I'm going to be hosting Global Forum 2020. We first created the Global Forum a few years back to bring together international security experts to explore the most pressing global issues in a critical and timely manner, and obviously we have such an issue today. The Global Forum series is designed to be an interim report. We're filling the space between what might be considered the journalistic first cut of history, and then the post-mortem that usually comes later in an academic journal article. We're trying to provide you with some fairly rapid responses to, of course, the issue that's chosen itself, which is the COVID-19 crisis. Now, we do have an ethos to the forum, and it draws on the legacies of two great Australian scholars. The first is a political philosopher, John Anderson, who taught at the University of Sydney for more than 30 years. And he taught under a rubric, and I quote him, he said, "The Socratic education begins with the awakening of the mind to the need for criticism, to the uncertainty of the principles by which it supposed itself to be guided." These are wise words, and we're going to try to stick to them in this forum. The second inspiration for this forum comes from probably one of the most famous of Anderson's students, Hedley Bull, the international relations expert, who wrote, I quote again, "that inquiry has its own morality and is necessarily submersive of political institutions of movements of all kinds, good as well as bad." So I want to keep both of those sort of iconic ghosts hovering above us while we explore today's topic, the COVID crisis, lessons learned, what next? So in the same way that the topic was in some ways predetermined, our format has been, we go out live, and as long as circumstances dictate, we're going out online. For those who cannot join us today, or for those who might be hearing impaired, we will be offering this program on our website, but also on the CISS YouTube channel. It'll be recorded, transcribed, and made available all to watch, see, and hear. Now, we have an incredible list of speakers here, but before I introduce them, I do want to pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to acknowledge the elders, past, present, emergent, but also their kin. We should remember the kin who died in the first recorded pandemic in this region when the Gadigal people were nearly wiped out by the smallpox virus that was brought by the Europeans to Australia. So history is important. It's a necessary reminder that pandemics are fundamentally human tragedies. In our discussion beforehand with my panelists, everybody's been touched by tragedy, sometimes 1 degree removed, sometimes further removed, but the COVID-19 virus has put everyone at risk, but we should remember as well, not equally so. Political, economic, racial, gender, other demographic factors could really mitigate as well as elevate the risk, but also the fear factors, making the COVID pandemic a security issue that clearly doesn't respect geopolitical boundaries, and it also cuts across a lot of the levels of analysis that we see coming out of universities. And it's why we sort of pride ourselves as CISS for being transdisciplinary, and we have people here today who represent that. Now, as I said, at the most basic level of security, what we're witnessing is a universal vulnerability of individuals. And that's the kind of definition of the key concept we're going to be looking at here is human security, which was first characterized by the United Nations. I believe it was a United Nations Development Program initiative. And it's important to revisit how they characterize human security. I'll quote here, "A child who did not die, a disease that did not spread, a job that was not cut, an ethnic tension that did not explode in violence, a dissident who was not silenced." But we've witnessed over the last month how just about every international institution and nation state has been, some more blatantly so than others, deficient in these categories, in stopping obviously the spread of the disease. Dissidents were and continue to be silenced. Jobs have been lost at levels not seen since the Second Cold War. Violence continues unabated and seems latent, if not imminent, within as well as between states. So really, these issues of human security are still with us, and in most poignant way in the way in which children are dying from the virus now, from overburdened healthcare systems, inadequate food supplies, but also from different forms of disease, often immune reactions to this virus. So if this whole question of security is what makes us safe, then I think the COVID pandemic has, unlike any other previous threat, except perhaps the nuclear one, thrown into high relief the failure, with a few notable exceptions, and we are in the lucky country in this regard, of both states and international institutions to keep us safe. I think in too many instances, decisions made, or frequently not made or just made too late, national as well as international levels, the matters have been made worse, not better. So there are lessons to be learned, and that's going to be part of our task today and over the coming months with the Global Forum. So we have our work cut out for us. We have with us representatives from the CISS research programs, which include biosecurity, ecosecurity, gender security, geosecurity, infosecurity, and regional security. Now, we're going to ask our participants to offer up an analysis of the COVID pandemic from the particular perspectives of their research areas. And I'm going to ask them all to make a first pass as well in the questions on lessons learned and provide some informed speculation on what we should expect next. Now, we want to make this as interactive a program as possible, and after the priming the pump with some questions, I'm going to immediately go to questions from our pre-registered audience. I just want to say to everybody out there, and thank you for joining us, we have quite a list, that these questions should be submitted through the Q&A function, okay? Not the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. That's the Q&A function. I will dip into the chat function in case some people don't get that or they come in late to this event. So very quickly, we have with us Justin Hastings. He's a professor in international relations, comparative politics, the research program leader here at CISS of regional security. His work is very interesting and timely. It's mostly on Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, East Africa, and he examines terrorism, smuggling, maritime piracy, insurgency, all those good things, but also nuclear weapons proliferation. We have Roy McLeod, who's a professor emeritus of modern history. He's written many books and many articles on biochemical science, the history of science, sociology of knowledge, and has written indeed on the plague in the past, and we're going to be looking to him to provide some historical perspective. Brendan O'Connor is Associate Professor of American Politics at the U.S. Study Center. He's been looking at and writing at for some time on American welfare policy, presidential politics, U.S. foreign policy, and most importantly for today on Australian-American relations, which are taking a big hit, it would seem, from this COVID virus. Susan Park is a professor of global governance. She's the research program leader of our new ecosecurity research area. Welcome, Susan. Her research includes international organizations, global governance, non-government organizations, and of course, global environmental politics. Finally, Aim Simpeng is our infosecurity expert. She's a co-founder of the Sydney Cybersecurity Network. Her research interests include comparative democratization and authoritarianism, digital media and politics, and she particularly looks at social movements in Southeast Asia. And I just want to mention that, but we're really happy with the fact that AIM and Justin's got a big grant to look at disinformation and how that's been influencing electoral politics as well. So I think with the questions, we're going to start in the neighborhood and then zoom out to some of the more global security issues surrounding COVID-19. And the first one kind of just, it's kind of one of those obvious questions. Early on, in fact, back in March, when President Trump went to the Center for Disease Control, he said that the US is going to lead this pandemic and lead the global fight. In fact, this is one of the first instances where we started to hear war. This is a war against the pandemic, and he was going to be the commander-in-chief. But now it seems that the US, this is sad to say and tragic to say, is only leading in the number of cases and deaths, and that leadership is being felt. That failure of leadership. Now, how is that, Justin, going to influence the view here in Australia and I think in the region of the US being, certainly in the past, the indispensable nation?
I think actually, if we're going to talk about the effect of the pandemic on regional security, this is not even a US story, really. This is a China story, right? And I was thinking sort of, well, how has this impacted regional security? And I think we can think of it in several respects, right? I mean, first from the Chinese perspective, you know, if you know Chinese politics and how the Chinese state works, nothing that China has done is at odds with how it has behaved over the past 20 years or so, right? So, you know, sort of the initial cover-up, the instance of sort of local leaders lying to the center sort of then trying to control what happens at the local level, sort of China then, you know, essentially exporting its issues and starting to sort of economically pressure other countries to do what it wants. I mean, this is sort of, in some sense, the pandemic is all the tools that China has been using, both domestically and internationally, now being brought to bear to accomplish its goals internationally, right? And sort of what you know, in some sense, this is not new. This is how China has always behaved. And now this has become, you know, in some sense, other people's problem as well. And that's where we see the regional security issue. And I think we can see that in terms of what's interesting to me is we think about the severity of the pandemic by country. In some sense, the severity of the pandemic is inversely proportional to a country's sort of distance from China, right? So the closer you are to China, the less severe the pandemic is, right? And you know, Australia in some sense fits in that category. Taiwan certainly does. South Korea does. Japan does. A lot of the Southeast Asian countries do. Singapore, you know, sort of blew up, you know, sort of for reasons that are unrelated to China. And sort of the question then is sort of, well, why is that the case? And the answer is they're already used to sort of how China behaves, right? They're already used to it. They had experience with SARS and how China reacted to that politically. And then they have experience in general, they know China lies. They know China will try to pressure them economically. And this has resulted in them in some sense moving much more quickly and much more decisively than countries that were further away, like the US and Europe. And I think that's how we see sort of regional security play out. This has not changed, in some sense, the trajectory of security in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia. You want to think about trajectory, it's basically just changed the slope rather than direction, right? Sort of countries are already becoming warier of China. They were already, in some sense, trying to move their supply chains out of China. They were already sort of concerned about Chinese economic coercion and disinformation, which is I'm working with AIM on. And I think, at least in Asia, this has just accelerated that trend, right? You know, sort of it's not the case that these countries will sort of change their trajectory entirely, but certainly they will be warier in the future of how they operate with China. And that's just, the pandemic just accelerated this. It hasn't actually changed that. I think sort of Europe and the US were maybe taken by surprise in some sense, but Asia wasn't. I mean, you know, sort of thinking about where a pandemic is going to come from, it was probably going to come from China, and it was probably going to play out the way that it actually has.
All right, thank you, Justin. I think that's a good way to head right over to Brendan, because certainly there's been a lot of talk about a new Cold War between the US and China, starting largely over the degree to which this was seen as the Wuhan virus, how there was a cover-up, where there's an effort to quell dissent in the medical community and even at the World Health Organization. And certainly there's been a bit of a yellow press, if we can call it that still. It's in the way that the Five Eyes dossier was linked to the US Embassy. They're saying that somehow or another there was intelligence that showed that this was coming out of a lab in China. My favorite headline was the Daily Telegraph just this weekend, Yanks on red alert. Is this something you're concerned about, Brendan? Do you see this as a new Cold War? Is this the Wuhan virus? What's your take on all of this in terms of the relationship between the US, security relationship between the US and the rest of the world, but also US-China relations?
Thanks for having me involved, James, and those are pretty big questions. And clearly there is a war of words going on. I mean, the use of the Wuhan virus is, I think, for more electoral purposes than anything else. It's something to, I think, deflect the blame that I want to talk about. Over the weekend, Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, on television described the virus as being seeded by China across the world from sort of the early parts of this year onwards to Milan and then New York and then everywhere else. So there's been some sort of pretty extraordinary claims. Obviously, most of us are aware that Mike Pompeo has described there being enormous evidence and, quote, significant amounts of evidence that the virus originated in the Wuhan Institute for Virology. Trump has similarly made these claims. So some major claims that have got a lot of headlines. And I suppose the first point to make is we're dealing in a sort of a situation where Trump is a sort of master of disinformation. Some of those press briefings that some of you might have forced yourself to watch were just extraordinary events and sort of propaganda, you know, bringing together the sort of combination of Trump's television background to science was not a happy mix for many of us watching. It was painful, I mean, depressing in lots of ways. But I suppose we've got to ask ourselves, what has been the aim of these sort of attacks on China verbally, and where would it head? And our first point is obvious, that it's a deflecting tactic. It's deflecting attention from the negative sort of press and the negative way, that the negligent way really that the Trump administration has handled the virus. The second point to make is that these attacks are about electoral politics. We're in an election year. All politics at the moment in the United States is really domestic, and it is with Trump always, I think. And we've been here before with red baiting or anti-Japanese politics in the 80s and 90s, with Trump's attacks on Mexicans and Muslims. So this isn't anything new. But I think there's a tendency with Trump to see what he's doing as unique, as Trump is a kind of sui generis figure, where I think that doesn't get us that far. I mean, populism is spread throughout the world. Corrupting effects of popular culture on truth are widespread. The conspiracy theory culture of the internet is basically a plague. And it strikes me that particularly on foreign affairs, Trump isn't that profoundly different to Bush or George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. And I want to sort of argue that in three ways and then come to 3 points about US-China relations. It strikes me that what differentiates a conservative approach from the sort of Republican presidents from Reagan onwards to, say, liberal or realist approaches to foreign affairs is a tendency to animate nationalism, not to moderate it. All of these presidents were keen to animate nationalism through conservative or neoconservative sort of ideas. And both of these approaches, conservative approaches and neoconservative approaches, tend to see the US military as a problem-solving tool. What's the point of having a hammer, I think Trump has said, in relation to even nuclear weapons, if you're not willing to use it? So it's sort of the sense of kind of a greater willingness to see militarism. Also, what distinguishes, I think, the conservative approach, which Trump has drawn to, from the neoconservative approach, is that conservatives tend to see foreign affairs as almost exclusively about domestic politics and electoral politics. Therefore, scapegoating one's opponents, talking about opponents being soft on foreign powers is commonplace. And this comes easy to conservatives, I think, generally in American politics, because there is a genuine lack of interest in the rest of the world. And the phrase America first is a perfect example of this. Where in contrast, say, neoconservatives tend to, I think, have more interest in investment in relations with other countries, particularly with Israel. How this affects, I think, Trump's view of China, I want to make 3 concluding points. I think we're clearly in this sort of problem that politics is being driven by low information and misinformation. And I don't think this is that particularly new either. During the Cold War, this was a problem. We think of the lack of understanding of, say, the Soviet Chinese War in 1969. I was reading about that today. I mean, Zhou Enlai in that war, or that sort of war of words really, described the Soviet invasion in 1968 of Czechoslovakia as an act of fascism. This was obviously something not really factored into American politics for a long time. George W. Bush's interventions in Iraq, similarly based on a lot of misinformation, low information, misuse of information. Secondly, electoral politics. China will be a plaything for the rest of the year for Donald Trump. And I think one of the challenges for China in this period, which you could see as a kind of say anything period in the political cycle, particularly on the Republican side, will be to ignore a great deal of it as posturing. The last most concerning thing about Trump is his militarism. This is the thing that worries me the most. I think we saw the clause of the American military states sort of slightly coming out earlier in the year in regard to Iran. And I think this had many people on the edges of their seats, as policy towards North Korea in the very early part of the Trump administration did. If an event occurs this year, like the Hainan Island incident in 2001, or Trump feels backed into a corner, this is, I think, when we can start to get very worried, because there's been very heavy military spending on hardware. throughout the Trump administration, and a severe underfunding and devaluing of the State Department and of diplomacy. So that's the thing that worries me most, although like most of you, I'm outraged on a daily basis by the briefings of the White House and the shenanigans. It's that at that military level, I think there is cause for concern.
Thank you, Brendan. I don't envy you having to watch, as part of your own research imperative, every one of those press conferences. We're going to turn to AIM because we've really been looking at how disinformation has been influencing some of these policy questions and security issues. And conspiracy theories have just taken off. And I was just wondering, is this, as Richard Hofstadter used to say, just catnip for cranks, or is this something to be concerned about? Is it just endemic to the paranoid state of U.S. politics, or is this now a global phenomenon? AIM, you've been looking at it from a regional perspective, but if you could also look at it from relation between Australia and the United States and other countries, if you'd really like to get your take on this.
Brendan is right that times like this is the breeding ground for conspiracy theories and misinformation, and it's not particularly new. It's definitely on a global scale. So why is it that conspiracy theories thrive in this kind of environment, especially because we see repeated attempts by governments, media organizations, and social media platforms trying to dispel, demystify all kinds of conspiracy theories. So there's basically a few key reasons for this. One is lack of trust in governments in general, and this is particularly pervasive in advanced democracies. Lack of transparency regarding the pandemic. This issue is unlikely to change, especially given what Justin has said about China, and its unwillingness to succumb to any kind of international pressure to be more transparent. And third, people are trying to look for explanations for things that they can explain, or they feel that the existing explanations don't suffice. If you look at any public opinion polls that are published, unfortunately there aren't many published in developing countries. You see that, for example, according to a poll done by both the Atlantic and the Pew Research, almost all Americans poll believe in at least one of the 22 prevalent conspiracies about coronavirus. In Australia, 1/8 of Australians believe that 5G is responsible for coronavirus, and 1/3 of Australians believe that nearly half of Australians believe that the Chinese cooked up this virus in a lab. You can count any number of European countries and very similar sets of beliefs in some of the prevailing conspiracy theories. So there's two key sort of strands of conspiracy theories right now regarding the pandemic. One is regarding the severity of the virus itself. And the second one is regarding the origin of the virus itself. And I think in Australia and in most of the Western countries, the doubt over the origin of the virus is most prevalent, but also its severity. So within Australia, with the data I look at, and we'll be looking more closely with Justin, Australia already has highly mobilized and existing networks of anti-vaccination groups. So the anti-vaxxers have been the most prominent in spreading and promoting this belief that, this is some kind of a government way to control citizens, to exert ultimate control over citizens, and that the government wants to force citizens to take vaccine. This is not out of line with other types of conspiracy theories going on around the world, but it's particularly strong, and it's probably the strongest in Australia because of the existing support base of the anti-vaccination movements here. Other types of conspiracies are prevalent here are the same as other countries. This is virus is a biological weapon used by China to exert greater control over the world, or conspiracy theory regarding 5G. So I think if we cannot get more clarity or information about the source of the virus and the severity of the virus going forward, it's unlikely it's going to do anything to help reduce the spread of conspiracy theories in Australia and beyond. I also believe that all of these conspiracy theories are now finding new ways to become more like transnational movements. So getting more connected, given this virus is very global, it's actually strengthening the transnational networks of these movements to cooperate more on what they do, learn from each other, and promote. They're basically advocacy groups, right? Promote what their activities both locally and globally around the world. So I think despite how much governments try their best to present facts, media organizations are doing it. I've noticed in this round that more than any other time that I've looked at so far, including the bushfire crisis in Australia, social media companies are stepping up more than ever to try to, basically they've changed their algorithms to push down content that is directly related to conspiracy theories and push up content that is produced by mainstream media or or organizations like the WHO. So, for example, you could go on YouTube and try to type coronavirus 5G, and you'll see that if you really want to look for conspiracy theory videos, it's a lot harder to find because it goes down the list. This was not the case before. YouTube has always been pretty bad about putting content that is popular rather than content that's factual. So I know they've tried to tinker around with their algorithms to do a better job at policing facts, and pushing information with credible sources up. But as you can see in public opinion polls, doesn't seem to work. So I don't really know if we can do anything about it. Definitely we can't do anything about it right now.
All right, well, thank you, Aim. We'll get back to this because we actually have some questions from the audience about this very issue, particularly about how it's covered by the press that we'll get to in a minute. We're going to turn to Roy McLeod, who's been looking over a long, illustrious career over the relationship between science and politics. And Roy, my question to you is, are we putting too much faith in science or not enough? Early on, there was a war between the scientific models of this pandemic that led to, in some cases, disastrous policy choices. Again, it's politics or politicians who choose which model, but the sort of battle between the Imperial College model and the Cambridge model and the Oxford model. But so ultimately, I guess my question is, are we relying too little or not enough on science in this case? And is there going to be a techno-medico scientific fix to this, what is ultimately a political problem? What's your take on this, Roy?
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're all good.
Good. Well, thank you for having me. There, of course, has been a long, the world has had a long experience of viruses, and it's interesting to see to what extent science has participated in what we've come to understand and practice. The ways in which contemporary science, of course, have responded have on the whole been largely underground and and only come to the public notice in times of crisis. Again, as a historian, I'm bound to recall that one of the earliest historians, Thucydides, makes his mark really upon history by recording the experience of Athens during the plague in the 5th century. And there, it was very important, and it was picked up by Hippocrates, the science of the day, if you like, to explain how it was that plagues came and came to determine public affairs. The issues that all of us have so far put on the table are by no means new. They've been with us for centuries. And whether this constitutes war, as a case between Athens and Sparta, or anything more recent, is really quite undecided. There were similar questions raised in the 1918-19 the Spanish flu pandemic. Again, representing a number of the questions that were not resolved at the time and haven't been really resolved since. Even some of the questions that, in fact, AIM has mentioned, has to say whether there were conspiracies or otherwise. Even the name of, the Spanish flu was not anything to do with Spain particularly. If anything, it was an American flu, because zero case was probably in Fort Riley, Kansas, which was then exported to Europe with troop ships. So the notion of picking up the nomenclature and then exporting it into a military context is by no means new. Equally, it is not new to see science being applied in industrial terms. That is to say, the application of statistics and epidemiology to the world has grown enormously from the experience of epidemics and pandemics. So we've learned a lot, which we've begun to model. In fact, the logistic curve, which we've all been trying to flatten, is a projection very much of early thinking about what happens in epidemic contexts. Of course, it's then applied, as it has been since the 18th century, basically, to economic systems generally. What happens in pandemics happens in markets. So there's a close affiliation between the natural world and the social world, the economic system, and the scientific understanding of nature. So all of these things are interconnected. I mean, it's important to keep this in mind. And I think it's very important, if you do Epidemiology 101, you will learn an awful lot about this. My sense is that the different models that have come to the fore all have a scientific basis. The so-called herd model, which was much discussed and now not so much discussed in the UK, which arguably has contributed to the enormous tragedy that the UK is now facing, it was predicated very much on the experience of smallpox. Which of course has beleaguered mankind throughout history, and has only recently, within the last century, come significantly under control. Now we think we've eradicated it. We hope we have. There are a few vials of smallpox which have been kept by the CDC and by the Russian equivalents, but broadly speaking, the situation has been more or less contained. But the notion of herd was based very much on the notion of acquired immunity. That if you can establish acquired immunity rapidly, then that will suffice and it will more or less contain. It won't eradicate the virus, but it will contain it. And that is sufficient for most public purposes. Well, this was established during the 19th century, but at a considerable cost. And the problem with herd is that you have to get about 80% of acquired immunity before it does work. So that, unfortunately, and of course that has social consequences. It means that the most vulnerable, the elderly, the ill, are put at risk. Aged care homes, the tragedies that we've seen, particularly in the UK, I'm afraid it's an important illustration to a certain extent, also even in Australia. This is what happens. So in fact, you have to look at a range of different models of infectivity. And what you then come up with are probably the three notions of eradication, suppression, containment, which are variously deployed. And they're overlaid in a kind of matrix fashion in a series of phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, which are very arbitrary, which have to do ultimately with social convenience and economic necessity, having to do with the locking down or the gradual lessening of locking down social behaviors with which we're all familiar. Well, these models are themselves highly empirical. They've been worked out over time. They are highly experimental. Sweden, as we all know now, has taken a kind of herd view to an extreme and is now rising in the league table, so to speak, and is threatening the supremacy, if that's the word, of the UK, even in the number of deaths, so certainly cases. And again, the Swedes are extremely good scientists, and they know what they're about. They produce Nobel Prizes in this subject. But they're also very conscious of ways of that different populations, whether they're homogeneous, whether they are largely ethnically mixed, or otherwise, it can contribute to the efficacy of a model in any particular time period or circumstance.
Hey, Roy, I want to get back to that question because we are seeing this sort of uneven development. We want to look at the global north and global south, not just focus on Europe. But we did have a question that came in about this issue of whether or not we're being well served by the media. A question from Ted Governance, Rhode Island, about whether or not we'd be better if we actually had science and medical correspondents assigned to cover the briefings rather than political journalists. Whether this would help prevent some of these outlandish, false conspiratorial claims to flourish. And I'm just wondering if, as someone at a university, we've been well served. We have many experts who've been on the press, we've been online, and I'm just curious as to if anybody wants to jump in right here, what can be done? I mean, what's the role of the university? What's the role of expert knowledge here? And why is it so easy to ignore it? Or is it a case simply that it's creating too much noise, that's contrary, that there is no one single message coming out of this community? If anybody wants to jump in on that.
Well, maybe I could make a few observations there.
But very quick, because I want to turn to the audience soon.
Oh, I beg pardon. Okay.
But go ahead, Roy. Go ahead.
I mean, firstly, the question is often put as a political question. It is not for scientists to decide. It's for the elected representatives to decide. And the elected representatives will argue whether they are state or federal or local. The scientists are on tap, but not on top, as the famous expression went. The scientists have been muted to a certain extent, and to a very considerable extent, in my view. I mean, you see this at every news conference that Trump holds. His scientists are kept more or less behind their masks these days, and where, of course, he doesn't. Of course, it's widely observed that Democrats wear masks and Republicans don't. But the idea, broadly speaking, is that the scientists are there to answer questions put to them. But the decisions are taken by the scientists. Now, my sense is that this is a tendency which is in fact violated in wartime, where the scientists set up the questions in the first place and then provide the answers. And the politicians then decide, well, which of these several answers they're going to work with. So our scientific leadership has been rather behind the mark, I think. You don't see many members of the Academy of Science in Canberra the Academy of Science itself coming forward, where I think it should have been right at the start, more or less saying better than I have been saying what the different models are and what we should do as a nation in response to these different models, taking account of the historicity of it all. Now,
thank you, Roy. That's great. I want to turn to Susan, because Susan, this is obviously a place where climate denial, the science wars has been playing out for some time. Is there anything you've learned from that experience that you can apply to the current COVID crisis, or any lessons to be learned there, the pandemic or the issue of the climate emergency?
Thanks for the question. What have we learned from the climate emergency that we can apply here is that it doesn't matter what the scientists say. I mean, they've been completely sidelined in the climate debate. I mean, we have populists that don't believe in climate change. So, I mean, what I find deeply disturbing about this pandemic, and there's a lot to be disturbed about, is precisely the fact that real emergencies are being pushed out. And so while we're dealing with a global pandemic, we're not addressing the climate emergency. And the scientists are just sidelined completely. And so I'd like to sort of point out that we are still in a climate emergency. April 2020 is the warmest year on record. I mean, that is just not going away. And we can point to the fact that there's been a drop in industrial activity and therefore a drop in the CO2 emissions, and everyone's applauding that. And we can see these wonderful pictures all that we're all looking at on social media of animals taking over civic places again. But in actual fact, that doesn't take into account the cumulative stock of CO2 emissions in the world. And essentially what this means is it's not going away, it's getting worse. I mean, 2019 has been identified by the World Meteorological Organization as having a global average temperature of 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels. And so what are we seeing? We're seeing ice melts, we're seeing sea level rises, we're seeing heat waves, droughts, we're seeing record intensity wildfires. You know, we had 200 bushfires in Australia that led to 33 people losing their lives, over 1 billion animals perishing, you know, over 12 million hectares burnt. And what does that do? It increases CO2 emissions, which feed back into that cumulative stock of emissions in the atmosphere. So this is a climate emergency that is being pushed to the background, and we're seeing exactly the same dynamics playing out in this pandemic. We're seeing a great distrust and deflection by China and the United States in terms of addressing the problem, and that is going to feed into the climate politics. As we know, the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, the climate talks, which were meant to be held in November of this year, have been pushed off to next year. Everyone's looking at the World Health Assembly to see how they're doing it virtually, whether or not you can have negotiations of 190 countries to get to some form of cooperation or some form of deal. It was hoped that the COP26, the Conference of the Parties, would actually come to an agreement as to how to address the climate emergency. And what the pandemic has done is really push that off to the sideline. UN negotiators just knew that there was no way you could get a deal without people in the room, in the side events, talking to each other, brokering those negotiations. And the 2015 Paris Agreement was really only made possible because of a bilateral agreement between the United States and China in 2014. And when you have the two largest emitters agreeing to take up and push this forward, that's when you're going to get real change. And so you can't have emitters like Australia who are just completely unwilling to recognise the extent of the problem, even while their own country burns. This is a real problem. So we know for a fact that you need leadership, and you need leadership from the largest emitters, and you need leadership from the great powers. And without US leadership in climate, you know, there was hope that we'd get something from the European Union, but you know, the research is telling us that it's the US that can really propel this action. They can make the bigger cuts. They can convince and cajole and negotiate with other states. And getting that agreement in 2014 did help lead us into the 2015 Paris Agreement. We do need nationally determined commitments. They are meant to be calculated. I mean, Australia's is just blown out because of the bushfires. And so the types of issues that we're dealing with in climate politics are exactly the same types of issues we're dealing with the global pandemic. How do you get virtual negotiations happening? How do you get the two biggest emitters, who are also the two largest powers, to get to some form of agreement as to how to move forward? These are the types of issues that we really need to address. And so, you know, on the one hand, people were quite happy with the fact that, well, the pandemic is slowing down CO2 emissions. People are now worried about how we open up the economy. And so there was some potential or some glimmer for hope that even though we'd lost the global momentum which had been building around the climate strikes and around the COPs, the Conference of the Parties for the UNFCCC, that we completely, that dipped. But then there was the hope that there would be some form of post-pandemic stimulus package that could feed into a global Green New Deal. We're certainly not seeing that in Australia with the types of activities being promoted by the federal government, which is really to dress up renewables, fossil fuels in renewable form, or some sort of version of that. Happy to take more questions on that, but I think I'll leave it there.
That's great, thank you. I guess that raises the big question. I want to just quickly get very short responses from anybody. That really, when you're dealing with these kind of global threats that don't really respect borders, be it a biological or a chemical or a particulate that has this capacity to create global harm, and yet we don't have any global institutions that seem to be stepping up now. We've seen this characterized as a war, and as we know that wars tend to be fought between nation states. Once in a while you can get a coalition together, but the nationalization and nationalism that's resulted from this pandemic doesn't augur well. If we're going to be looking ahead, how do you get international institutions to step up? And we talked about getting people to wake up to the dangers of these global threats and the inability of states to solve them. But how do you get the international institutions to step up? I know that our UN General Secretary's called for a ceasefire, and we've had the World Health Organization have a meeting that that seemed to have some positive results, largely because of Australian leadership for an independent inquiry into the origins of the virus and how to prevent a recurrence. But I'm going to give you the question of, that Clausewitz often said, how do wars end? What's the center of gravity here, and who's going to be able to end it? Or are we just in a state of permanent war when it comes to these global threats? That's a big question. If somebody's going to give me a real short answer, because we got some really great questions coming up, and we're going to go over a little over time, so we're going to get these questions from the audience. But if any of our colleagues who are muted now, if they just want to wave their hand, if they'd like to address this. Justin, we haven't heard from you for a while. You started this off. Did you have anything to say about it? And then we'll go down the list.
In terms of how wars end, or?
Well, what's the center of gravity and who's going to step up? Is it going to come from nation states? Is it come from coalitions? Is it going to come from international institutions, regional, transnational organizations? Where do we look for the solutions right now?
Well, look, I think it depends on what the threat is, or the nature of the threat, right? I think there is an assumption in a lot of the literature back in the 90s on sort of non-traditional security that international coordination was sort of the base requirement for dealing with the threats, because they were transnational threats fundamentally. But in some ways, especially when we think about pandemics, what we're seeing is that arguably the most effective responses, for countries have been to, not focus on coordination internationally, and at least temporarily cut themselves off from the rest of the world. That's what Australia did, right? That's why we can't leave. So in that sense, it would depend on what the actual threat is. I think sort of, many of the responses to the pandemic domestically have to be domestic policies. Do they need to be coordinated? Well, certainly you want to coordinate information. Certainly you want to coordinate sort of thinking about, sort of sharing best practices and things like that. But the actual policies on the ground are fundamentally domestic in this case. It could be different for a different kind of threat.
Susan, I saw you too, wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, so what I found really interesting about this is, how do we strengthen international institutions to be able to address the problem? And it comes back to sovereignty. States are the ones who've tried to ensure that they retain control as to their borders and what comes in and out. So criticizing the World Health Organization for not making enough of a noise or not investigating, well, it still has to have the permission of the sovereign state, right? And this is why states can say there's nothing to see here when clearly there is. We know that Australia promoted this idea of the giving them weapons inspector-like powers. Well, whether or not states would ever agree to that, when the possibility is no longer that, that now it can spread everywhere, and we have viruses because we're losing habitats, we are increasingly coming into contact with new types of viruses for human beings. So whether or not states are actually willing to give up their sovereignty, I'm not so sure.
Brendan, please.
Electoral politics again matters here. I mean, earlier this year we had this strange happening of this, late 70s socialist from Vermont on the horizon of American politics. And if revelations about Joe Biden's maybe behavior towards women had come earlier, or there hadn't been a sort of coordinated response of Buttigieg and Klobuchar getting out, we may have had the very unlikely sort of of a Biden of a Sanders presidency. I mean, what is clear, I think, with Trump is that anyone can beat Trump and anyone can lose to Trump in a race, because it's so, he's such a kind of unfortunate campaigner and sort of where he'll take things. But it requires, I think, as Susan is saying, a very different attitude from the United States. And quite strangely, for those of us who've been following American politics for a long time, there is this kind of plan of a Green New Deal in the United States, which is something we haven't seen the likes of in the past. And that politics, whether it is 4 years away or 8 years away, isn't impossible to imagine. I mean, much worse is possible to imagine as well, in terms of a more sort of a militaristic second term of the Trump presidency. But a very different politics is also being expressed in the United States that gives at least me some hope to get up in the mornings.
Okay. Roy, please. Sure. Yeah.
On this point, Peter Harcher had a nice piece on the weekend in which he questioned the reliability of the United States as an ally, and of course, and made a number of the points that we've been discussing as well. And I've been interested by the way in which Morrison has led a discussion among countries which are doing well in the crisis and which are cooperating. I wonder to what extent we need necessarily always look to the United States for the solution. There is perhaps a reason for us not to, insofar as we can gather together and see important aberrations, so to speak, Latin America, Asia, where Africa, goodness knows, where we can band together, and where the United States is not going to express leadership or direction or give direction.
More than one observer has noted that if the American century ended at any point, some people are pointing to that moment, where in March, where suddenly people realized that the planes were not going to come from the United States, to bring help. It was the other way around.
Yes.
So it has been a wake-up call in that regard, and we're still waiting to see. So I just want to turn to some of the questions, because the questions we've been getting from Simon Ray Atkinson and also from Ken, and I'm going to band some of these together, and also an early one from Kashav, is that is this the right time to make these assessments? Are we just simply peering into the crystal ball, so to speak, or what's the advantage right now of the criticism? So are we just bashing, or can we offer up alternatives? That's come out in some of the questions here, and I think we as not just simply academics but as concerned citizens do have responsibility to turn whatever little expertise we have to these questions. But I think people are really crying out for some positive alternatives right now. There is this opportunity. I mean, we all know it's a truism, out of crisis opportunity, but you would think that we'd be better prepared for the next one and realize this is not a one-off event. We don't know where this asymptote in particular is going to end, but we know there's going to be more. And I'm lumped together some of the questions from three people here, but does anyone want to deal with that in particular before we move on to other questions? I'm just looking for, just feel free to unmute and step in if you have something to say about it. Otherwise, we'll turn to some of the other questions. Because that was more of an observation there, but okay, well, then we'll turn to the other one. Populism has come up a few times. We understand why I think people are fearful and why I mean, this seems to be one of the trends of pandemics. First, there's shock and fear. I should actually backtrack. First, there's complacency. Oh, this can't be really happening. And then comes the shock and the fear, but then also comes the blame and pointing the fingers. And unfortunately, we see it turn into an us versus them. All of you have touched on that. How do you break that kind of binary, creating the other, the hostility? And I have to say, I'm of two minds. On one hand, I think China has to own up that, the virus looks like it did start there, and we lost a vital month because of, if not, there was denials. First of all, there was human-to-human transmission going on, and then there was suppression and of dissent of the medical community. So I think that we have to, find responsibility here and own up to it. But how do we avoid putting it into categorization of a whole peoples? I mean, other viruses obviously came with their place names of their origin. Roy pointed this out. The Spanish flu was misnamed, but Ebola, a river, I believe, or MERS, which was Middle Eastern, the Hong Kong virus. So I'm just curious as to, maybe we are overreacting to this idea that maybe we should be calling this the Wuhan or China virus, and depoliticize it and get the technical expertise in to figure out how to stop it from happening again, particularly out of wet markets. So anyways, I'm going to throw that out there if anybody wants to respond.
Well, yeah.
Sure, Ray, go ahead.
To just broaden that slightly, that is to say, the virus is not just a human issue. It's an animal issue. And of course, we look to the source of virus as affects us. But there have been many attempts to bring together, of the legions of viruses there are in the world, series of studies that would elucidate the relationships between hosts. Now, we associate the Wuhan story with the coronal, shall we say, inquiry that's going to go on, that will be looking at the source of our present discontents, will illuminate some of this. But very few people are talking about intermediate hosts. And if we look at intermediate hosts, which are bringing the bats together with the wet markets, then we may well be looking at the environmental questions, which are bringing the bats into the markets in the first place. That's to say, there are close connections, and Susan hinted at this, not just political connections, but there certainly are, but close natural connections between ecological movements that are bringing viruses. They're bringing viruses from Queensland into New South Wales, as we know now, and many of them are avian viruses, and some are related to bats. Now, the particular intermediate host, which is prominent, feature the pangolin has one kind of infamy, momentary infamy in this, may well be an example. It may or may not be the right example, but it's certainly an example of a way in which we have to bring together different discourses. So it's not just a question of looking at particular countries or peoples, but is looking at a range of natural phenomena. And
I got that point. That's great. That's probably what, you just stated the mission of CISS, which is to be transdisciplinary, transnational, because that's the nature of the threats now. They don't really stick to the internal borders of a state, a nation state. We're coming up close to our finishing time, but so I just want to give everybody a chance to respond for those questions we've left on the table. We're going to be coming back in June and carry on with this format, but we're going to change in that we're bringing in international guests. We just wanted first to showcase, I think, the talent we have at home before we reach out abroad, but also I think it's important to get this global international perspective. I mean, it's clear that isolation has stopped or suppressed the virus, on a national level, but it's not sufficient. We have to find a way to come together to deal with these global issues, how to deal with denial and then the panic that follows, how to be safe and also to be resilient when these strike. And I think the lessons learned, and this is like a question we had for a couple of people as well, is that that this pandemic is really asking deep questions about the world order. do we have to find ways to restructure the world order? Maybe, you know, liberal democracies are, you know, this is one of the first kind of controversies that were mooted, whether or not authoritarian states deal better with this or not. And I think that's been effectively, at this point, shut down with resurgences in some authoritarian states as well. It really requires, I think, the best possible scientific expertise, good leadership. We've been blessed in the fact that in Australia, people came together rather than, I think, became politically polarized on this, and that has happened in other countries as well. So with that, I would like to always end with something of a moment of hope and a time of somewhat of despair and fear, but we're going to keep dealing with this issue because it's not going to go away, and there's other issues that are going to come up that really tax the ability of nation states to effectively cope with them. So we're going to be looking at the efficiency, the efficacy, the ethics of our responses, and we're going to be hopefully moving from lessons learned to what next in the future. In the future, we're going to be bringing together our research program leaders and having global forum dedicated to each of these specific areas of ecosecurity, infosecurity, geosecurity. So please join us again. If you'd like to learn more about us or have other questions that you'd like to see us address in future forums, contact us at CISS, that's CISS, at sydney.edu.au. I want to thank all our guests. We had quite a crowd here, and judging from the questions, we've started a conversation. And thank you all for coming, and be safe, be well, and be kind. So thank you, and over and out. And thank you to all our participants.